When Sheriff Brennan lifted that blood-stained floorboard in the Morgan basement, he found something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A leather-bound diary filled with desperate handwriting, human hair woven into twisted patterns, and a final entry that read, "They're coming for us tonight." But the Morgan family had vanished without a trace 12 hours earlier, leaving behind only their half-eaten dinner and a house that seemed to whisper with unseen horrors. What happened in that basement would shake the very foundations of Black Hollow and reveal a truth far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The morning mist clung to the weathered wooden church like a shroud, and Reverend Thomas Whitmore felt an unusual chill as he prepared for Sunday service. Black Hollow was a community where punctuality was sacred, where the same families had occupied the same pews for generations. So when the Morgan family's customary third row remained empty as the church bell tolled its final call, an uncomfortable silence settled over the congregation. "Perhaps they've taken ill," whispered Mrs. Eleanor Crenshaw to her husband, though her voice carried the uncertainty that comes with broken routine. The Morgans, Samuel, his wife Margaret, and their 3 children, had never missed a Sunday service in the 12 years they'd lived in Black Hollow. Reverend Whitmore's sermon that morning felt hollow, his words echoing strangely in the small wooden sanctuary. The autumn wind rattled the windows with unusual force, and more than one parishioner found their gaze drifting to the empty pew where the Morgan family should have sat in their customary black wool clothing, silent and devout as always. After the service, concern grew like a spreading stain. The Morgans weren't merely absent, they were invisible. No one had seen smoke from their chimney that morning. No sign of Samuel tending to his small plot of land behind their modest 2-story home on Elm Street. "I'll check on them," declared Sheriff Jacob Brennan, a man whose weathered face had seen enough of frontier life to know when something felt wrong. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, he made his way down the dirt road toward the Morgan house, his boots crunching on the carpet of fallen leaves that October had painted in shades of rust and gold. The house stood silent against the darkening sky, its windows reflecting the last rays of sunlight like vacant eyes. Sheriff Brennan knocked on the heavy oak door, the sound echoing through what he now realized was an eerily quiet neighborhood. No dogs barked, no children played in the nearby yards, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Samuel? Margaret?" His voice felt swallowed by the silence. The door was unlocked, unusual for a family as cautious as the Morgans. As it creaked open, Brennan stepped into a scene that would later be described in newspaper reports as disturbingly ordinary. The parlor was immaculate, furniture arranged with military precision. The dining table was set for 5, complete with half-eaten meals that looked as though the family had simply stood up mid-bite and walked away. A bowl of stew sat cooling, a child's spoon still resting in the thick broth. Bread lay partially buttered on a plate, the knife balanced precariously on the edge, but it was the grandfather clock in the corner that made Brennan's blood run cold. Its pendulum hung motionless, the hands frozen at 3:17. In a house where everything else remained perfectly in order, that stopped clock felt like a scream in the silence. "Hello?" Brennan called out, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. "Is anyone here?" The floorboards creaked under his boots as he moved through the house. Upstairs, the bedrooms were neat as a pin, clothes folded, beds made with hospital corners, personal items arranged with obsessive care. But there were no signs of packing, no indication that the family had planned to leave. As darkness began to creep through the windows, Brennan lit an oil lamp and noticed something that made his throat tighten, scratches on the wooden floor leading from the kitchen toward a narrow door he hadn't noticed before. The scratches looked fresh, as if something heavy had been dragged across the planks. The door led to a basement staircase that descended into impenetrable darkness. The air that rose from below carried a smell he couldn't quite place, earthy and metallic with an undertone of something sweet and rotting. Every instinct told him to leave, to return in the morning with reinforcements. But Sheriff Jacob Brennan had spent 20 years on the Pennsylvania frontier, and he'd never walked away from his duty. He descended the stairs, each step echoing in the confined space. The basement was larger than he'd expected, extending under the entire house with stone walls that seemed to absorb the lamplight. And there, in the furthest corner, he saw something that made him understand why the Morgan family had always been so quiet, so withdrawn, so careful to keep to themselves. The walls were covered in symbols, not carved, but burned into the stone as if branded with a red-hot iron. Strange geometric patterns intertwined with what looked like letters from no alphabet Brennan had ever seen. Hanging from the ceiling beams were twisted bundles of hair, human hair in different shades, braided with black thread into complex knots that seemed to move in the lamplight. But it was the mirror that dominated the far wall that truly terrified him. 8 feet tall and framed in black wood, it was completely covered with heavy cloth that had been nailed into the frame. Even covered, it seemed to pull at his vision, as if something behind the fabric was trying to break through. Brennan forced himself to examine the scratches he'd followed down here. They led directly to a section of the stone floor that looked different from the rest, newer somehow. When he knelt and pressed his hands against the stones, they shifted slightly, as if they'd been recently disturbed. With trembling fingers, he pried up the loose stones, revealing a small hollow in the earthen floor beneath. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. The writing inside was in Samuel Morgan's careful script, but the words made Brennan's hands shake as he read, October 10th, 1872. The voices from below grow stronger each night. Margaret tries to convince me it's merely the wind through the foundation, but I know better. I know what we awakened when we first came to this place. The children hear them too, though they're too frightened to speak of it. Little Mary asked me yesterday why the shadows in the basement move when there's no one there to cast them. Thunder rolled across the Pennsylvania mountains as Brennan read, and he realized he was no longer alone in the basement. Something was watching him from the darkness beyond his lamp's reach. Something that breathed with a rhythm that didn't match his own. Sheriff Brennan's hands shook as he clutched Samuel Morgan's journal, the weight of the leather-bound book feeling heavier than any Bible he'd ever held. The breathing in the darkness had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was somehow worse, a waiting silence that made his skin crawl. He forced himself to continue reading, desperate to understand what had happened to the Morgan family. October 12th, 1872. I found Margaret standing in the basement at 3 in the morning, staring at the covered mirror. When I asked her what she was doing, she said she'd been called down, that something had been whispering her name. She had no memory of leaving our bed. The children are having nightmares every night now. Thomas, our youngest, swears he sees people walking through the walls, people who aren't there. The entries grew more disturbing as Brennan read on. Samuel wrote of finding his wife and children gathered around the mirror in the early hours of morning, all of them sleepwalking, their eyes open but seeing nothing. He described how the house seemed to grow colder each day, how food spoiled within hours of being prepared, how the very air felt thick with malevolent presence. October 15th, 1872. I spoke with old Henrik Carlson today, the man who sold us this house. He claims he never mentioned the previous owners, but I pressed him. 3 families lived here before us, he finally admitted. The Blackwoods, the Hartmans, and the Stones. All of them disappeared without a trace, all of them left in the same way, suddenly, completely, as if they'd never existed at all. Brennan's lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the symbol-covered walls. He noticed something he'd missed before. The symbols weren't random. They formed a pattern that seemed to spiral toward the covered mirror, as if everything in the basement was designed to focus attention on that shrouded surface. October 18th, 1872. I removed the cloth from the mirror today. God help me, I removed it. What I saw there, it wasn't my reflection. It was something else wearing my face, something that smiled when I screamed. Margaret found me an hour later, collapsed on the floor, bleeding from my nose and ears. I covered the mirror again, but it's too late. They've seen us now. They know we're here. The journal's final entries were written in increasingly frantic handwriting. October 20th, 1872. The children are changing. They speak in whispers now, words I don't recognize. Mary drew a picture today of our family, but in the drawing, we all had the same face. The face I saw in the mirror. Margaret has stopped eating. She says the food tastes like dirt and ash. October 21st, 1872. They're coming for us tonight. I can feel it in my bones, in the way the house seems to breathe around us. The voices from below are no longer whispers. They're calling our names, demanding we come down. The mirror is uncovered again, though I don't remember removing the cloth. In its surface, I see not our basement, but another place entirely. A vast cavern filled with figures that move in the shadows. October 22nd, 1872. This is my final entry. If someone finds this journal, know that we went willingly in the end. The mirror showed us the truth. This house is not in Black Hollow. It never was. It exists in a place between worlds, a trap for families like ours. We thought we were moving to Pennsylvania, but we were really moving into their domain. The voices weren't coming from below, they were coming from home, our real home. And now they're calling us back. They're at the door now. I can hear them climbing the stairs. Margaret is smiling and the children are laughing. We're going home. We're finally going home. The journal ended there, but Brennan found one final note scrawled in the margin of the last page. The mirror is the door. Break it and you break the spell. But beware, breaking it may release what lies behind. As if summoned by the words, Brennan heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps that creaked across the floorboards in the same pattern he'd heard when he first entered the house. Someone, or something, was walking through the Morgan home, following the same path he'd taken. The footsteps stopped directly above the basement door. Brennan extinguished his lamp and pressed himself against the stone wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. The basement door creaked open and he heard the footsteps begin to descend the stairs. But these weren't the footsteps of one person. They were the footsteps of 5, walking in perfect synchronization. In the absolute darkness, Brennan heard a child's voice whisper, "Sheriff Brennan, we've been waiting for you." The voices that called to Sheriff Brennan from the basement stairs were achingly familiar. The voices of the Morgan family, speaking in perfect unison. But there was something wrong with the sound, something that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. The voices were layered, as if each person was speaking multiple words at once, creating a harmonious discord that human throats shouldn't have been able to produce. "We knew you'd come," said Margaret Morgan's voice, though Brennan could see nothing in the darkness. "We've been watching you read Samuel's journal. We've been waiting for someone to understand." Brennan's hand found his revolver, though he knew instinctively that bullets would be useless against whatever was speaking to him. "Where are you? What happened to your family?" "We're home," came the reply, and this time it was clearly young Thomas, the Morgan's 6-year-old son. "We're finally home, Sheriff, and we want to show you something wonderful." A soft light began to emanate from the covered mirror, seeping through the heavy cloth like moonlight through storm clouds. The basement grew visible again, but everything looked different now. The symbols on the walls pulsed with a faint luminescence, and the bundles of hair hanging from the ceiling moved in patterns that suggested a wind Brennan couldn't feel. "Look behind you, Sheriff," whispered Mary Morgan, the middle child. "Look at the stairs." Brennan turned and felt his sanity slip another notch. The stairs he'd descended were no longer there. Instead, the basement opened into a vast cavern that stretched beyond the reach of sight. The walls were covered in the same symbols, but these were carved deep into living rock, and they glowed with an inner fire that had nothing to do with earthly flame. "The house moves," explained Samuel Morgan's voice, now coming from somewhere in the cavern's depths. "It's not a building, Sheriff. It's a living thing, a creature that feeds on families, on the bonds between people. It lures them in with the promise of a new life, then slowly digests them, adding their essence to its own." The light from the mirror grew brighter, and Brennan could make out shapes moving in the depths of the cavern, figures that walked upright but moved wrong, their limbs bending in ways that human joints shouldn't allow. As they drew closer, he realized they weren't people at all. They were amalgamations of the families who had lived in the house before, their features blended and distorted into something that was neither fully human nor entirely alien. "We're still here," said Margaret's voice, and now Brennan could see her standing near the mirror. But it wasn't Margaret as she'd been in life. This thing wore her face like a mask, stretched and distorted over a frame that was too tall, too thin, too angular to be human. "We're all still here, Sheriff. The Blackwoods, the Hartmans, the Stones. We're all part of the house now, part of its family." "What do you want?" Brennan managed to ask, though his voice came out as barely a whisper. "We want you to understand," said the thing wearing Samuel's face as it emerged from the shadows. "We want you to see what we've seen. The house doesn't just take families, it creates them. It brings together people who belong together, who understand each other completely. We were never happier than we were in our final days, Sheriff. We were never more connected." The mirror's light grew blinding, and Brennan had to shield his eyes. When he looked again, the cloth had fallen away, revealing not his own reflection but the interior of the house as it really was. The rooms were filled with families, dozens of them, all living in perfect harmony, all sharing the same distorted features, all speaking in that same layered, harmonious discord. "The mirror shows truth," explained the thing that had been little Thomas. "It shows what lies beneath the surface of things. What lies beneath the surface of you, Sheriff Brennan." In the mirror's depths, Brennan saw himself as he truly was. A lonely man who'd spent his life serving others while never forming meaningful connections of his own. He saw the empty house he returned to each night, the absence of a wife's voice or children's laughter. He saw the years stretching ahead of him, more of the same isolation until death finally claimed him. "We can fix that," whispered Mary's voice, now coming from directly behind him. "We can make you part of our family. You'll never be alone again, Sheriff. You'll never want for company or understanding. All you have to do is stay." The offer was tempting, more tempting than Brennan wanted to admit. The loneliness that had followed him his entire adult life suddenly felt unbearable, a weight that threatened to crush him. He thought of his empty house, his solitary meals, the way conversations died when he entered the town's only saloon. But then he remembered Samuel Morgan's journal, the final entry about going willingly. He remembered the warning scrawled in the margin: "Break it, and you break the spell." "No," he said, and the word came out stronger than he'd expected. "No, I won't stay." The things wearing the Morgan faces hissed in unison, their features shifting and flowing like wax in flame. "Then you'll never leave," they said. "The house has marked you now, Sheriff. It knows your taste, your essence. No matter where you go, it will follow. No matter how far you run, it will find you." Brennan drew his revolver and aimed it at the mirror. The bullet shattered the glass, and the sound was like a scream of rage and pain that went on far longer than any echo should have lasted. The cavern began to collapse, the symbols on the walls flashing brighter and brighter until they hurt to look at. The last thing Brennan saw before the darkness took him was the true forms of the Morgan family. Not the distorted things that had been speaking to him, but their actual spirits, trapped and twisted by the house's influence. They looked at him with expressions of profound gratitude as the mirror's destruction freed them from their prison. Sheriff Brennan awakened to sunlight streaming through broken windows and the sound of voices calling his name. He was lying on the floor of the Morgan house's parlor, surrounded by Deputy Marshal James Crawford and 3 other men from town. The basement door was sealed with what looked like decades of accumulated dust and cobwebs. "Sheriff, thank God you're alive," Crawford said, helping him to his feet. "Mrs. Crenshaw saw you enter the house yesterday evening. When you didn't return, we came looking." Brennan looked around the parlor, disoriented. The dining table was empty, covered with a thick layer of dust. The grandfather clock in the corner had stopped at 3:17, but its wooden case was warped and weathered as if it had been abandoned for years. "How long was I unconscious?" he asked. "Unconscious? Sheriff, you've been missing for 3 days. We've been searching the entire valley. 3 days. Brennan felt the weight of Samuel Morgan's journal in his coat pocket, the only proof that his experience had been real. He pulled it out, but the leather cover was cracked and faded, the pages yellowed with age. When he opened it, the writing was there, but faint, as if it had been written decades ago. "The Morgan family," he said urgently. "We need to find them. They're in danger." Crawford exchanged glances with the other men. "Sheriff, there's something you need to know. We checked the town records. There never was a Morgan family in Black Hollow. The house on Elm Street has been empty for 20 years. "That's impossible. I saw them. They attended church every Sunday. "Sheriff," Crawford interrupted gently, "Reverend Whitmore says no family by that name has ever attended his services. We asked around town. No one remembers the Morgans." Brennan stared at the journal in his hands. If the Morgan family had never existed, then whose diary was this? Whose experiences had he shared in that nightmare basement? He flipped to the final entry, but the words were different now. October 22nd, 1872. "The house has chosen its next guardian. Sheriff Brennan will serve well, just as I have served, just as those before me served. The mirror may be broken, but the house remains. It will rebuild itself, as it always has. And when it does, it will need someone to guide the next family home." The handwriting was his own. "We need to leave," Brennan said, his voice hollow. "We need to leave now." But as they exited the house, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The other men were walking in perfect synchronization, their footsteps creating that same harmonious rhythm he'd heard in the basement. When he looked at their faces, their features seemed to shift and blur, as if he was seeing them through warped glass. "The town's been worried about you, Sheriff," Crawford said, and his voice carried that same layered quality that had characterized the Morgan family's speech. "We've all been worried. But now that you're back, we can be a family again." Brennan broke into a run, leaving the others behind. But as he reached the edge of town, he found himself standing in front of the Morgan house once again. The road that should have led to the county seat instead curved back on itself, returning him to the very place he was trying to escape. He tried again, taking a different route, but every path led back to Elm Street. The house stood waiting for him, its windows glowing with that same soft light he'd seen emanating from the mirror. And now he understood the truth that Samuel Morgan had discovered too late. There was no Black Hollow. There never had been. The entire town was part of the house's domain, a construct designed to provide the perfect environment for its feeding. The townspeople he'd known for years, the church he'd attended, the streets he'd walked, all of it was an elaborate illusion designed to keep its prisoners content while it slowly consumed them. But unlike the Morgan family, Brennan had broken the mirror. He'd damaged the house's power, and now it needed him to repair what he'd destroyed. It needed him to serve as its caretaker, to guide the next family into its embrace. As the sun set over the false town of Black Hollow, Sheriff Jacob Brennan walked back into the Morgan house. He had work to do. The mirror needed to be rebuilt, the basement needed to be prepared, and somewhere out there a real family was making plans to move to a quiet town in Pennsylvania where they could start fresh. He opened Samuel Morgan's journal, his journal now, and began to write. October 25th, 1872. Today I begin my duties as the house's guardian. The Hendersons will arrive next week, a family of 4 looking for a new beginning. I've already prepared their story, their history, their place in the town's memory. By the time they realize the truth, it will be too late. The house will have what it needs, and I will have fulfilled my purpose. The mirror is healing itself, the cracks filling with some substance that isn't quite glass and isn't quite flesh. Soon it will be whole again, and the basement will once more serve its intended function. I understand now why Samuel Morgan wrote that they went willingly in the end. The house doesn't just take families, it creates them, and in creating them, it creates purpose. I am no longer alone. 2 weeks later, the Henderson family arrived in Black Hollow just as Sheriff Brennan had predicted. Robert Henderson, a blacksmith seeking new opportunities, his wife Catherine, a school teacher, and their twin daughters Emma and Sarah, both 7 years old. They came with a wagon full of belongings and hearts full of hope, looking for the quiet life that small-town Pennsylvania promised. Brennan watched from his office window as they spoke with the town's mayor, a construct of the house that wore the face of a kindly old man named Morton Graves. The conversation followed the same pattern it always had. The house on Elm Street was available, the rent was reasonable, and the previous tenants had left suddenly due to a family emergency back east. "Such a shame about the Morgans," Mayor Graves said, shaking his head sadly. "Lovely family, always kept to themselves, but lovely people. I'm sure you'll find the house to your liking." As the Henderson family toured their new home, Brennan felt a familiar mixture of guilt and anticipation. He'd spent the past 2 weeks preparing for their arrival, crafting their identities in the town's collective memory, ensuring that everyone would remember them as longtime residents within days of their arrival. The house was eager for them. Brennan could feel its hunger radiating from the building's very foundations. The mirror in the basement had healed completely, its surface now clearer than any glass had a right to be. The symbols on the walls pulsed with renewed energy, and the bundles of hair hanging from the ceiling had grown thick and lustrous, as if fed by the anticipation of new victims. But something was different this time. As Brennan watched the Henderson family move their belongings into the house, he felt a presence beside him that hadn't been there before. When he turned, he saw Samuel Morgan, not the distorted thing that had spoken to him in the basement, but the man himself, translucent and shimmering like heat waves rising from summer pavement. "You're having second thoughts," Samuel said, his voice barely audible. "I have no choice," Brennan replied. "The house won't let me leave. It won't let any of us leave. There's always a choice, Jacob. I made mine when I uncovered the mirror. You made yours when you broke it. The question is, what choice will you make now?" Brennan looked at the Henderson family, watched as little Emma and Sarah ran laughing through the rooms that would soon become their prison. If I don't help the house, it will find another way. It will take them anyway, but without my guidance, their suffering will be worse. Will it? Samuel asked. Or is that what you tell yourself to make serving easier? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Brennan had spent 2 weeks convincing himself that his role as guardian was necessary, that he was providing mercy rather than enabling horror, but watching the Henderson children play in the cursed house, he began to doubt his rationalization. What happened to your family? He asked Samuel's spirit. Really happened? We were consumed, Samuel replied simply. Not killed, not transformed, consumed. The house fed on our love for each other, our bonds, our shared experiences. It took everything that made us a family and added it to its own essence. What you saw in the basement were echoes, memories given form. The real Morgan family died the moment we willingly entered the house's embrace. And the other families? The Blackwoods, the Hartmans, the Stones, all consumed, all reduced to echoes and memories. The house grows stronger with each feeding, Jacob. It's not just a trap. It's a predator that evolves with each kill. Brennan felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Then what am I supposed to do? I can't leave, I can't fight it, and I can't save anyone. You can choose, Samuel said, his form beginning to fade. You can choose to be guardian or executioner. You can choose to guide families into the house's embrace, or you can choose to warn them away. The house will punish you for defying it, but punishment is not the same as powerlessness. What kind of choice is that? The only kind that matters, the choice between complicity and resistance. Samuel's spirit vanished, leaving Brennan alone with his thoughts and the weight of impending decision. Below, the Henderson family was settling into their new home, unpacking their belongings, making plans for their future in Black Hollow. They had no idea that they were arranging their lives in a mausoleum, that every moment of happiness they experienced was being cataloged and prepared for consumption. As night fell over the false town, Brennan made his choice. He walked to the Henderson house and knocked on the door, his heart pounding with the certainty that he was about to change everything. Catherine Henderson answered, her face bright with the exhaustion and satisfaction of a successful move. Sheriff Brennan, how nice to meet you. We've heard wonderful things about Black Hollow from Mayor Graves. Mrs. Henderson, Brennan said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. I need to speak with you and your husband. It's about the house. Oh, is there a problem with the deed? The mayor said everything was in order. No, ma'am. It's about the previous tenants, about what really happened to them. Catherine's smile faltered slightly. I thought you said they moved back east for a family emergency. I lied, Brennan said, and felt the house's attention focus on him like a searchlight. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant, and the windows began to rattle in their frames. They didn't move anywhere, Mrs. Henderson. They're still here, and if you don't leave tonight, you'll join them. The house's rage was immediate and overwhelming. Every door in the building slammed shut simultaneously, the sound echoing through the street like gunshots. The gas lamps flickered and died, plunging the interior into darkness. From the basement came a sound like screaming, but pitched too low for human ears to fully comprehend. What's happening? Catherine cried as her daughters began to weep. The house is angry, Brennan said. It's angry because I'm breaking the rules, but the rules were written by monsters, Mrs. Henderson. Get your family and leave. Now. This is insane, Robert Henderson said, appearing behind his wife. Houses don't get angry. This is just a storm, or maybe the foundation settling. Look at your daughters, Brennan said urgently. Look at them carefully. The Henderson parents turned to their children, and Brennan saw the moment when they realized the truth. Emma and Sarah were standing perfectly still, their eyes rolled back until only the whites showed. They were speaking in unison, their voices layered with harmonics that made the adults' teeth ache. Don't listen to him, Mama. Don't listen to him, Papa. He's trying to take us away from our new home. He's trying to separate our family. That's not your children speaking, Brennan said. That's the house. It's already begun the process of consumption. If you stay, it will take everything that makes you a family and add it to its own power. The house shuddered around them, and Brennan felt claws of ice digging into his brain. The punishment for defying the house was beginning, but he forced himself to continue speaking. The basement has a mirror. Don't look into it. Don't let the house show you what it wants you to see. Take your family and drive away, and don't stop until you reach the next town." "The children," Catherine whispered. Something's wrong with the children. Emma and Sarah were changing, their features becoming fluid and indistinct. They were still speaking in that layered voice, but now the words were in a language that predated human speech. The house was revealing its true nature, dropping the pretense of normalcy in its fury at Brennan's betrayal. "Go," Brennan said, blood beginning to trickle from his nose as the house's punishment intensified. "Take them and go. The house can't hold you if you refuse to stay willingly." Robert Henderson grabbed his daughters, and their forms solidified back into normal children. They looked confused and frightened, but they were themselves again. Catherine gathered their coats and the few possessions they'd unpacked, and within minutes the family was loading back into their wagon. "What about you?" Catherine asked as they prepared to leave. "What will happen to you?" "I made my choice," Brennan said, feeling the house's claws digging deeper into his mind. "I chose resistance over complicity. Whatever comes next, I can live with it." The Henderson family drove away into the night, their wagon disappearing into the darkness beyond Black Hollow's borders. Brennan watched until he could no longer see their lantern, then turned to face the house's retribution. The building was changing, its walls flowing like water, its windows becoming eyes that burned with malevolent intelligence. The false town around it was dissolving, revealing the true landscape beneath, a wasteland of broken stone and twisted metal, littered with the bones of those who had served the house before him. "You've made a grave mistake, Jacob Brennan," the house spoke, its voice emanating from every surface at once. "You've denied me my sustenance. You've broken the covenant between guardian and dwelling." "Good," Brennan said, wiping blood from his nose. "I was never meant to be your accomplice." "Then you'll be my prisoner instead. You'll spend eternity in the basement, adding your voice to the chorus of the consumed. You'll watch as I find new guardians, new servants, new families to feed upon, and you'll know that your defiance accomplished nothing." The house began to pull him toward the basement door, but Brennan had one final card to play. He pulled out Samuel Morgan's journal, his journal now, and held it over the oil lamp he'd been carrying. "If you imprison me," he said, "I'll burn this. I'll burn the record of your methods, your patterns, your weaknesses. The next guardian will have to start from scratch, and they might not be as easily controlled as you think." The house's pull lessened. "You would destroy your own work? I would destroy everything I've done to serve you," Brennan said. "Every plan, every preparation, every moment of complicity. I'll burn it all before I let you use my knowledge against another family." For a long moment, the house considered. Then, with a sound like grinding stone, it began to change again. The walls solidified, the windows became glass once more, and the false town of Black Hollow reconstructed itself around them. "Very well," the house said. "You may remain as guardian, but know this. I will find other ways to feed. I will evolve beyond your understanding, and when I do, your resistance will become irrelevant." "Maybe," Brennan said, tucking the journal back into his coat. "But at least I'll have tried." As dawn broke over Black Hollow, Sheriff Jacob Brennan walked back to his office, knowing that his real work was just beginning. The house would bring other families, attempt other deceptions, seek other ways to feed its hunger. But now it had a guardian who understood the true nature of his role. He sat at his desk and began to write a new kind of journal, not a record of successful hunts, but a guide for future resistance. Instructions for any who might come after him. Warnings about the house's methods. Strategies for saving those who might otherwise be consumed. The house could make him its prisoner, but it could not make him its willing accomplice. And sometimes, in the battle between good and evil, the refusal to cooperate was the most powerful weapon of all. In the distance, another family's wagon appeared on the road to Black Hollow. Brennan watched them approach, then picked up his hat and walked out to meet them. "You folks lost?" he asked as they drew near. "Not lost," the man driving the wagon replied. "We're looking for a place to settle. Heard there might be opportunities in Black Hollow." "I'm afraid you heard wrong," Brennan said. "There's nothing here for families, nothing good anyway. You'd be better off trying the next town over." The man looked confused. "But we received a letter, an invitation." Said there was a house available, perfect for people like us. Brennan felt the house's attention focus on him again, felt its anger at his continued defiance. But he also felt something else, a presence that might have been Samuel Morgan's spirit, or the combined will of all those who had been consumed, lending him strength. Whoever wrote that letter, he said, was lying. Trust me on this. There's nothing in Black Hollow worth staying for. The family turned their wagon around and headed back the way they'd come. Brennan watched them go, knowing that he'd won a small victory in a war that might last forever. The house would not give up, would not stop trying to feed. But now it had an enemy within its own walls, someone who understood its nature and was willing to fight. As the sun climbed higher over the false town of Black Hollow, Sheriff Jacob Brennan returned to his office and continued writing his guide for future resistance. He had work to do, an eternity to do it in. But for the first time since breaking the mirror, he felt something that might have been hope. The house could imprison his body, but it could not imprison his choice. And as long as he could choose resistance over complicity, the families who came seeking a new life in Black Hollow would have someone fighting for them. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes, something was enough.